Good evening, everyone. It's Lockster here. It's Lockster here. It's Tony here from Lockster Reads. I've forgotten my own name. Um, I haven't read much today. I have been. God, I seem to be permanently unwell at the moment, and I have a sore throat, which is really annoying me. Although you can't hear it, so I don't know whether it's just a thing. I read one of the short stories from the Penguin Book of Short Stories, First World War stories, which is John Galsworthy's Told by the Schoolmaster. Galsworthy, I've never read anything by Galsworthy. He seems to be unfashionable in 2025. I think he is the writer that Anthony Powell uses as a character in A Dance to the Music of Time, and is slightly scathing about. The story's actually about a young. It's told by a schoolmaster about a young boy who is 16 who joins up faking his age, which happened a lot, and called Jim Beckett, and his young love Betty Ruth, and he goes off to fight in the war, and then he comes back on leave. They get married. She gets pregnant. He's on the front line. The Battle of the Somme is underway. He comes back on leave, and then things go astray. I don't want to. I'm never sure with these whether to spoil them or not, because I don't know whether. But suffice it to say, this touches upon a subject which one of the books that I am theoretically going to read this month, Blindfolded and Alone, touches upon, which is the execution of deserters in World War One by the British Army. It's quite a good little story. It's very moving, and it does make me feel that perhaps I should read some John Galsworthy. I've no idea where to start with him. I think he wrote quite a lot of books, but I'll take a look. I'll do a Google and look at his Wikipedia page. I do find actually that the Wikipedia pages for most authors very useful. As a sort of introduction to who they are, what their backgrounds, and getting lists of what they wrote. It'd be useful to have a sort of a site, a Wikipedia adjacent sort of recommended places to start with authors, particularly older authors. And then I read another chapter of Heroes Twilight by Bergonzi, which I'm finding really interesting. I'd read Fussell before, so this is a new one to me. This chapter is Poets 3, which is Edward Thomas and Ivor Gurney. Edward Thomas I've not really read anything by, apart from anything that crops up in World War One poetry anthologies. He was killed in World War One. He was an artilleryman. He joined up relatively old. The reason that the two of them are together is that they are focused very much on. I suppose to use a line from English pastoral mode, their writing is very much focused on, as he says here, two poets with particularly intense devotion to rural England, going beyond conventional patriotic sentiment or the Georgian weekend cottage, were Edward Thomas and Ivor Gurney. Their achievement has become more apparent in recent years, in part because of the dedicated work of biographers and editors. I would like to read more Edward Thomas. I did start a biography of him, which I think was called All Roads Lead to France, which I need to reread. It was a more recent biography than the ones listed in here. Edward Thomas was a friend of Robert Frost, and I didn't realise actually that Robert Frost lived in England for a period of time. I always think of him as such an American writer that you can't imagine him outside America. So that and it was Frost that basically encouraged him to write poetry. He was writing guidebooks and um, things like the South Country or a literary pilgrim in England. But it was Frost that basically said to him, "You're half a poet already. Write poetry," or words to that effect. Um, so he did. Most of his poems, though, were written before the war. Almost all of them were written before the war started. Um, and if and and the only writing he seems to have done during the war itself were like little diary entries. Um, he was killed on the 9th of April 1917 by an exploding shell. Um, it's now Ivor Gurney. I've talked a lot more about his story. I don't know. It's hard when you have young men dying in huge numbers to suggest that one writer's fate is sadder than any others. All. I was trying to remember the quote about all human life matters. Anyway, but Ivor Gurney has a particularly tragic story. It's told very effectively in the now out of print The Ordeal of Ivor Gurney by Michael Hurd, which was first published in 1978. I wish somebody would republish it. I said this last year. I think it's a book deserving republication, even if somebody else maybe extends it and writes around it. But Ivor Gurney was a poet and a composer. His music is still performed. He wrote a lot of English songs, and he put some of Edward Thomas's poems to music. They are probably the two. I mean, it said in the book. He talks about the fact that Gurney read a lot of poetry, and Edward Thomas was the man that felt he had the most in common with. Gurney's rural writing is is really focuses particularly on where he grew up, which is the Gloucester, Cotswolds area, and it's that he comes back to all the time. Um, he ended his life. He In 1922 he was put in an asylum, and he basically spent the remainder of his life there, and he died in I think 1937. I'm sure it's in here somewhere, but he died in the 1930s anyway. Um, and actually, there's a story in here that Thomas and Gurney never actually met face to face, but um, Edward Thomas's widow Helen visited Gurney in the asylum where he was confined. Um, and I'm going to read this bit, and it might make me cry, so because it made me cry when I read it at the time. So be careful. So, she said, the next time I went with Miss Scott, I took with me one of Edward's own well-used ordnance maps of Gloucester, where he had often walked. This proved to have been a sort of inspiration for Ivor Gurney. At once spread them out on the bed, and he and I spent the whole time I was there tracing with our fingers the lanes and byways and villages of which he knew every step and over which Edward had walked. He spent that hour in revisiting his beloved home, in spotting a village or a track, a hill or a wood, and seeing it all in his mind's eye, a mental vision sharper and more actual for his heightened intensity. He trod, in a way we who were sane could not emulate, the lanes and fields he knew and loved so well, his guide being his finger tracing the way on the map. It was most deeply moving, and I knew that I had hit on an idea that could give him more pleasure than anything else I could have thought of, for he had Edward as his companion in this strange perambulation, and he was utterly happy and without being overexcited. This way of using my visits was repeated several times, and I became for a while not a visitor from the outside world of war and wireless, but the element which brought Edward back to life for him, and the country which the two could wander together. Ivor Gurney is I mean, it's upsetting me now. Ivor Gurney's fate. It, he was probably mentally ill before the war. He was probably mentally unstable before the war. The war certainly didn't help. And it was the saddest thing is he never got to see Gloucester again because he was put in asylums in I think Kent or just outside London, but nowhere near Gloucester. I think the book says they were afraid if they took him back to Gloucestershire, he'd commit suicide. Um, but I think Ivor Gurney's story is absolutely is in an era of death of young men. It's odd to pick a man who survived as possibly the most tragic story in that. I mean, there are probably more tragic stories, but the fact that he by the end of his life he was incoherent and is just astonishing sad. And also the fact that you think in 2025 he could have probably been treated more effectively and more humanely. Um, yeah, I think of it often. I also think it also made me think about patriotism and whether it's possible to be patriotic in a way that doesn't make you place yourself above other people. Whether a love of England in is possible that isn't the Reform UK version of a love of England, and I think it is, and I think Gurney and Thomas sort of show an example of that. Um, but it's something to think on. So that was my reading today. I'm sorry it wasn't more. I am a bit behind based on what I was planning to do, um, but yeah, it was good. It was good reading, even if it was not a huge amount of reading. I will catch up with you tomorrow, hopefully with more to say. I am probably going to read some Isaac Rosenberg tomorrow. Um, I did read a couple more of his poems, but I didn't read enough to talk about them, except to say, as I said, I think I get a Blake vibe from them to some degree. I also get a bit of a Don vibe from them, or the early ones at least. But that I am a bear of very little brain, so it might be that I'm totally. Actually, this is something I meant to say yesterday. This might end up being long. Um, the danger with reading books by literary critics about books you haven't read is that they give you a guideline to what you're reading that affects how you read these books when you get to them. And I think it is better to read a writer without the literary critics, without the notes, without the introductions, to make your own mind up. Even if you struggle with a book, even if you struggle with you can. I mean, I'm not saying don't look things up. If you struggle with a word, look it up. But try and you need to make. I think you need to make your own decisions about something that starts with the basic choice: did I like that or did I not like it? And then you can go back and say and try and analyze it in a bit more depth. What you got out of it, what you don't. I'm not saying you don't need. That it's not useful to have tools to help you analyze these things, but I think you should read the critics, the introductions, the notes, etc. after you've read the book first to decide what your thoughts on it are, what you think its themes are, what you think it's trying to say, what you like or don't like about it, and then you can get help from literary critics to see things you might have missed, or you can challenge what their view of it is with your own view. Literary critics usually have the advantage of having a broader amount of sort of hinterland on what they've read. If you've only read one book by, or let's say one short story by John Galsworthy, it's hard to say anything more about John Galsworthy than I quite like that short story. It makes me kind of want to read some more of his stuff. You can make guesses at what Galsworthy's politics might be based on the subject matter of that short story and the tone it takes. But an academic who specialises in John Galsworthy's, well, not even specialised, an English literature academic who's read broadly is always going to sort of have a better armament than you are. But that doesn't necessarily mean they're always right. And I think the one thing all this reading has made me think is you need, and it kind of applies to history as well, in that you shouldn't just assume. You need weapons to challenge historians on their. You can't just say, "I don't think that's right," with no evidence at all. You can question it, and and if you really want to go in depth, you can go back to original sources and stuff. But again, you shouldn't just assume that a historian's view of an event, the causes of an event, the consequences of an event, the long-term impact of an event, the short-term impact of an event, whatever, are absolutely correct. You are entitled to go, I'm not sure I agree with that, and then you can decide whether or not you just want to go, okay, I don't agree with that, but I don't care enough to go and dig into it in more detail. Or you can go, I care enough about this that I need to read more books on this subject so I can compare and contrast. And with history, that's the thing to do, and biography, I think that's the thing to do. It's like, how can you make your mind up about General Haig if you only read one biography? Now you can decide that's all you want to read, and you can kind of make up your mind. But if you really think I'm not sure this is fair, or I'm not sure this is unfair, you might want to dig into it in more detail. So there are lots of biographies about Haig. It's hard to do, obviously, with people that don't have multiple biographies written about them over the course of almost a century. But I think it's important. I think I'm not knocking expertise here, by the way. I think expertise is important. One of the reasons I wanted to interview the person that I'm interviewing is because this person knows about a subject that I know only the fringes of. But an expert, and it's hard-earned expertise. We're getting degrees, postgraduate degrees, PhDs is hard intellectual work. Everybody I know who has done a PhD at some point wanted to throw it in the bin and hated every moment of it. I'm not saying sure everybody who's doing a PhD is like that, but a lot of the people I know who did it, I never did my MA or my PhD, and even though I wanted to, and that's not to say I can't ever do one, but I think so. This is hard work, one expertise, but I don't think that automatically means you have to agree with them on the themes of a book, or or whatever. And that's all I wanted to say, because I'm starting to rant a bit now, so I'll stop. But I just wanted to add that, because I meant to add that yesterday, but that video went quite long, so I've done it today. So I will speak to you all tomorrow, hopefully in a better frame of mind, hopefully with more read, and have a good night. Speak to you soon. Bye bye.